My name is Ron Westrum. I am a sociologist. I'm a theorist of organizations, and I've developed a method for classifying organizational cultures in terms of their ability to have information flow. These range from pathological cultures, where information flow is terrible, to bureaucratic cultures, where information flow is routine, to generative cultures, where information flow is outstanding.
We wanted to start with something fundamental and talk about defining organisational culture. Maybe you describe the characteristics, the properties of organisational culture, and give us some useful ways of thinking about it.
Well, basically an organizational culture is the operating system of the organization in terms of how people are expected to behave, how they're expected to think, and even how they're expected to feel. An organizational culture is something that permeates the organization in all its functions. People arrive in the morning with certain expectations. They leave at the end of the day with certain feelings and so forth as a result of having been in the organization. Organizational cultures are very much like a living organism, and unlike national cultures, which are more or less stable, organizational cultures can change relatively quickly. And that means that organizational leaders can change organizational cultures relatively quickly.
So what's a good metaphor to help us understand the role, the impact of an organisational culture? You say it's living and it's experienced by everybody. How should we? Is there a good metaphor for describing it so leaders, when they're thinking about it, they can describe it?
Well, it's like a personality. Every organization has a personality, just like every person has a personality, and organizations develop that personality over time, but also in many cases, when there's been a change of leadership, they rapidly adapt to the new leader. Everybody watches for what the signals are, and those signals are various. I mean, one of them is, what does the leader say? What are the images and symbols the leader invokes? But also, who does the leader remind them of? Have they been here before? Do they understand where he or she is coming from? So to understand organizational culture, it's as I say, it's similar to personality, but the key thing is essentially, what does it expect people to expect?
And you talked about what people watching, and you talked about leaders' symbols. I'm guessing that a lot of this is unstated, it's communicated tacitly.
Absolutely. Well, it's, as a professor, the most similar thing is that basically when a new professor takes a class, the students are just, they have all their antennas vibrating, and they want to know what's really going to be expected. And it's so much more important when you're part of an organization, because this is going to shape your life, your working life, for whatever period it is. Leader is the person that, if you can, you'd love to lean on and expect that that person will watch over you. Even more important in many cases, the higher the person is in the organization, the more impact they have on what's going to go right or wrong with the organization. So it's not just whether you like the personality or not. Is this the person on whom basically your whole working life is going to depend? Are they going to make the right decisions? Do they have the right ideas? Can you trust them? And obviously what they're looking for is something that you are eager to find out.
So there's a lot of elements of power, and you talked about leaders going higher up, and the higher up the leaders, the more, I guess, the more influence they've got on this. But you also said some positive things from a leader point of view, that they can shape the culture, that it's alive, that it's living. I'm guessing that is going to take more than simply rewriting the list of values.
Well, values are something that's shaped by what people do. The leader communicates is what kinds of things are going to be expected. And so...
Okay, that's really... Sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
No, I think this is... The leader is going to be watched very carefully to see what kind of things they permit, what kind of things they're not going to permit, who they are. And as you say, many of the things are tacit in the sense that they are things that people pick up. What does a leader talk about? What kind of image does a leader evoke in the people he or she talks to? Because people live sometimes in an imaginary landscape. One of the things is the landscape is constructed by leaders. What is going on? Is it a fight? Is it a walkthrough? Is it something that people can basically trust in and believe in and allow themselves to be immersed in? The leader creates meaning by the things that he or she does. Even as a leader comes into the room, if there is a room, people will watch. Who does the leader look to? What does the leader do? Does the leader look after people? Is the leader going to push people around? What happens if somebody makes a mistake? How is the leader going to respond? Everything the leader does is going to be very carefully scrutinized. But also people can read by the kind of policies a leader puts in place, and especially by the people the leader puts in place, what is going to be encouraged, what's going to be allowed, what's going to be punished.
So that's what broadly organizational culture is a great rich definition. We can understand that. You've given us something very valuable. You created a model that gives us all a map. So you've figured out a way of describing the characteristics of different organizational cultures, and you gave us a way of categorizing them into one of three types. Can you firstly just describe the three types at the highest level?
Well, let me just say, in looking for a way to classify the sort of types of organizations, this is something that troubled me for many years, because I thought there's got to be some way to weave your journey through the thicket of organizations and figure out how it really works. What is it that really counts? And I remember in the beginning, I just felt, this is a big morass. You can't make your way through this. So the issue is, what kind of cultures are out there, and how are they going to make a difference? I was forced to do this because I was working in the aviation industry, and one of the big issues we had was, how do we prevent accidents? How do we recover from accidents? How do we make sure that everybody's going to be safe? Well, clearly the organization is going to have a big impact on that. So what are the differences that make a difference? And so I remember at the time I was reading a lot of literature on accidents, and I thought, what is it that gets the organization to be able to prevent accidents? How does the organization recover from accidents? And I said, okay, so there's a fundamental difference between the organizations that are good at doing this stuff and organizations that are not. What is the fundamental difference? And it was that led me to think about different kinds of cultures. So
did you start with two?
Yeah, I did. In looking at organizations, the first question I tried to answer was, why are some organizations highly creative and others not? So the issue of creativity came up first. As I progressed, though, I began to realize we needed to think also about organizations that are really bad, that are really dysfunctional. So we have to have a category for that as well. So these three types: the generative organization, highly creative and innovative; the bureaucratic organization, very predictable, steady, and so forth; and the pathological organization. The pathological organization is oriented around the idea that everything that the leader does is what's important. And so the leader's welfare, the leader's glory, the leader's income, that's the thing that the leader in a pathological culture will emphasize. How are you going to help me? And when you see that kind of signal, it stiffens, the person's feeling about the organization, because now the main thing they need to do is protect themselves from being put upon by the leader.
So let's go through each of those in turn, starting with the generative organizational culture.
Sure.
Can you talk about what the leaders preoccupied in a generative organizational culture, and also how that affects the style of information flow within that organization?
The generative leader is concerned with the organization's mission. Everything is secondary to the mission. So it's important that essentially the leader looks to anything that's going to move the mission in the direction that the leader wants it to go. Now, this means also, of course, that the leader is going to be less sensitive to the needs of people who have egos that need to be stroked. It's going to be less sensitive to the needs for people who are in power to be rewarded. And also, unlike bureaucratic organizations, be less sensitive to the boundaries of departments and divisions and so on within the organization. The generative leader tries to think of all these things basically as a huge organic mechanism that's going to advance the organization's achievement. And so, less concern about departments, less concern about the egos of the divisional or department leaders and so forth. The generative leader is going to look for what's going to get the organization to the goal. And this is also very important in terms of people's sense of meaning, because by concentrating on the goal, the organization's mission, the leader inspires people, gives their lives meaning, and allows them to identify with the mission themselves. Also, by getting out of the way all the detritus of departments and so forth, and egos, remuneration, so on, the leader wants to get the job done. And tends to look basically at the organization and its processes as a way of getting the mission accomplished.
And when things go wrong, what's the leader in a generative culture? What's their response?
Well, the first thing they have to do is make a sound analysis of what's going wrong. What needs to be supported, what needs to be avoided. Instead of looking for somebody to as a scapegoat, the leader will try to concentrate on what's the answer. How do we get from where we are to the answer? So you would expect someone to take a reflective view of what's going on, what has gone on, and then connect what people's actions are to getting the changes and improvements and so forth in the organization that are going to allow those kinds of things to happen, the positive things.
And their response to novelty, what would that be?
Well, getting the mission done in most cases requires them to get people to invent. So the proper stimulation and culture of ideas is a key part of what any leader does. So you're not going to get the job done until you get the innovation which is necessary to provide the answers to the current problem in its current situation.
So in contrast, a leader in a bureaucratic organizational culture, what are they preoccupied with?
Well, they're preoccupied with, essentially obeying the rules, making sure that department boundaries stay stable. If you're at the departmental level, you want to make sure that your department is going to get the work and get the gravy and so forth, and other departments will probably not. In a bureaucratic organization, it is important to maintain the standards, to maintain the department boundaries, to make sure that everything is going according to plan. Hopefully there is a plan, but whatever the plan is, that's what you've got to maintain. And so the bureaucratic organization is is focused on getting the job done in the way that is expected to be done. And that's great if you're trying to get a payroll out or something like that. It's not so great if something unexpected occurs. How does the organization then swerve and then take account of the new changed circumstances? What are you going to do?
How do they respond to failure, to when things go wrong?
Well, usually what happens is you get organizational justice. So whoever has screwed up is the one that, is going to suffer whatever punishments or rearrangements for what they've done. But the problem is that the bureaucratic organization will focus on what has happened. The generative organization, by contrast, will focus on what needs to happen. So it's not as important to punish people. I think of the famous bottle of champagne story about Wernher von Braun, who was working with the Redstone missile, and one of these big prototypes went off course and crashed. And von Braun said, well, let's find out what happened with the rocket and so forth. And then after all the analyses and so forth, they realized that they didn't know what had happened. And now they were faced with the design of a new type of Redstone missile. And at just that point, an engineer came forward and said to von Braun, I think I probably might have caused this. He said, because I was working on the circuit and I touched something with a screwdriver and I got a spark. So maybe I'm responsible for what happened. So they checked. He was responsible for what happened. That was the thing that basically got the missile to go off course. So von Braun sent him a bottle of champagne, because the important thing was that they had solved the problem, that they got an answer, and not, that this person should be punished for having made a mistake, because people make mistakes all the time.
And in a bureaucratic culture, how does a leader respond to novelty? What's novelty seen as?
Annoying. It's novelty is something that you now have to, worry about. So rather than providing a help, it's a hindrance to getting the job done. Sometimes the novelty turns out to work great, but that's not what you really asked for, and you want to concentrate on what you asked for rather than what now is available to you.
Now, what about leaders in a pathological culture? You talked about that, and you sort of implied that that's your third model of culture that arrives. So tell us about what leaders are preoccupied with in a pathological culture.
Well, they're preoccupied with keeping their own power going. And so they tend to classify people into two categories: people who can help them and people who can hurt them. And their concern is essentially to make sure that the people who can hurt them are tied down or bypassed and so forth. And they are happy to have people who are willing to help them. But the problem is you've now separated people into two groups. One group are our friends, the other group are our enemies. And if you're on the enemies list, you're in big trouble.
So that's going to affect information flow in the organization.
Well, of course, nobody wants to be the person who failed to give the right information, or a person who gave the wrong information, and therefore people are always concerned that what they do is something that's not going to bring down revenge or punishment on their heads.
And if they fail?
Well, if they fail, you get rid of them. I mean, you can't have people who screw up. And so for the pathological leader, somebody who's identified as a screw up is automatically sidelined, if not actually fired.
So nobody's going to share bad news.
That's right. Yeah, and so people in pathological organizations, for the most part, don't speak up if something goes wrong. And they're concern essentially is to make sure that if something goes wrong, it's on somebody else's shoulders, not your shoulders.
So, dare I ask about novelty in pathological organisation? What happens to the good idea that somebody has?
Well, if it works out, you take credit. If it doesn't work out, you make sure that whoever did it suffers. Generally, novelty is something that screws up whatever you probably planned. So it's not necessarily welcome. And there really isn't a way of rewarding people who did the unexpected that worked, except that to show that in the beginning you understood that that was going to work, and that's why you worked with them. So it also means, by the way, that information tends to be hoarded or dispersed depending on who it's going to help and who it's going to hurt.
So information is power. It's being used in the power game.
Absolutely, yes. And so you find in organizations that are pathological, I have been in a couple, also that the metaphors that describe winning an argument are things where you crushed someone else. You beat them up, and even more nasty metaphors get used. And the whole discussion basically is about winning and losing. And losers are described in the most negative terms and as people who, deserve to be trashed or hurt in some way.
So you created these three models of organisational culture and put them together in what some people now call the Westrum model or the Westrum Continuum. We've got a topology of organisational cultures. Sarah's visualised it. We can share that. And there are different variables. You talked about some of this, the level of cooperation, how messengers with bad news are treated, how responsibilities are defined, bridging between teams or units, and the response to failure and the response to novelty. So you've got these models, and they're individually they work, and there's a continuum. How do you see them today? Are they ideal types? Are they connected? How are you thinking about them as you look at them today?
Well, originally I thought of these three cultures as sort of, as you say, ideal types. But the interesting thing is that what I found is the people around me were aligning them in a continuum or some sort of, with pathological at the bottom and generative at the top and bureaucratic in the middle. And I think that's actually a very good way of thinking about it. But each of these cultures is distinct in the sense that if you're in a pathological culture, there's all sorts of different reflexes you have than you have in a generative culture. And ditto for a bureaucratic culture.
Do you think people experience their organisation as mostly living in one of those cultures as when they go to work?
Yes, but it's instinctive. You feel the tension in the air if it's a pathological organization. You stay low because anything that stands up is likely to get shot. In a bureaucratic organization, really what you're looking for is continuity, standardization. You have the right response, which somebody already has laid out. It's interesting to think about the bureaucratic culture as a culture in which there are standard solutions for standard problems. And as long as you have standard problems, you've got a standard solution. And you can do it. And it works, for a while anyway. In a generative organization, by contrast, all the tools that you have are constantly in the process of being constructed. So innovation is very helpful because it's new tools to do whatever job you're trying to do. And you pay attention and nurture the people who come up with the new ideas. And this also means, by the way, that if one of those people comes up with something that fails, you don't discard the person, you discard the idea. And in fact, in the organizations I've studied in research and development, you expect for a big screw up every so often. But you don't punish the people who screw up. You encourage them to keep trying and to actually do better.
Listening to you describe it, it feels like people who go to work and their organisational culture around them is pathological. Work is going to be a pretty miserable place.
Yes, and when they get home at the end of the day, they're going to be wrung out, angry, depressed, kicking the cat or the dog and so forth, and yelling at the spouse or whatever is likely to be a standard practice, because this is the way you deal with the nastiness of the environment. One of my students used to work for, well, his father worked for a company that was very pathological. A lot of alcoholism, a lot of potential suicides, hostility in the workplace. It got so bad that one person used to carry a gun to work. And if you're in an environment like that, it's very painful for you during the time that you're in the work environment. But when you come home, it's hard to shed it. It's hard to get rid of it. It's hard to get rid of the feeling that somebody's trying to hurt you, or that you're trying to avoid getting hurt.
And then the description that you gave as the bureaucratic organisational culture and the generative organisational culture, it brought to mind for me the difference between the success in being able to exploit something that works, as you said, in the bureaucratic organisation, but in the generative organisation, people are exploring all the time. There's constant exploration. Does that feel right to kind of contrast the two?
Yeah, I think the thing is, in a generative organization, you don't know what necessarily is going to work. So you constantly have to experiment to find out what that is. In a bureaucratic organization, you look at the rule book. You know, what am I supposed to be doing in this situation?
And then in a large enterprise, you might find different units set up differently. So you might have some exploratory generative cultures, and at the same time others which are much more a bureaucratic culture, as they repeat, as you said earlier, the payroll, they repeat something. Does that feel right, that within one enterprise you might have different pockets where people experience the culture differently?
Yeah, I think that the bureaucratic organization is best when they're giving a standard response to a standardized problem. The problem is that in a generative organization, the issue is things are constantly coming up. You're going to face new things. How are you going to deal with the things that today you don't have a solution for, but tomorrow you need to evolve a solution? Well, generative organizations are going to give people the permission to experiment, to try, to see what can possibly work out better.
So Ron, you've described the different ways information flows in the three cultures and the critical difference it might make to both organisational safety and to improvements. Can you describe the spectrum of responses to anomaly and how information flows in response to an anomaly?
Right. When something goes wrong, what's the response going to be? So if you look at a generative organization, the response is going to be one which is it's reflective. It tends to focus on finding out what specifically has gone wrong and how it can be corrected, or what new problems the problem is going to bring up. As you go through the spectrum of organizations, you'll see basically organizations that have this reflective, thoughtful response. But there are a variety of other ways that you can adjust. So something that's also important in a generative culture is essentially looking at something where you make a systematic fix. For instance, if you got a fleet of airplanes and one of them shows a problem, then you're likely to check all the other airplanes that have that same subsystem and make sure that they're okay.
We just saw that with Airbus finding one problem with software on one flight, and there was a global implementation immediately, or flights were grounded until that particular issue was taken out of the whole fleet.
Yes. And in fact, I think this is one of the contributions that aviation has made to the issue of fixing problems, is that if it's wrong in one of these things, maybe it's wrong in the others as well. And it's because aviation is so focused on safety that you have to make sure that if something is wrong in one plane, that all the other planes that are like it have to be checked to make sure that it's not wrong with those planes.
What's the difference with the bureaucratic culture? Where would the fix be there?
Well, a bureaucratic culture tends to respond reactively rather than reflect, in terms of reflection. If you fixed a problem in one part of the organization, you don't necessarily think of checking the other parts. You fix the problem that presents itself, but not necessarily the stuff that is hidden. By the same token, in fixing something, the most important thing is it looks good to the public or whoever the customers are. It isn't important that you've actually fixed the problem, but you've made it look as if you fixed the problem. So the optics, as they say in politics, is a very important thing. In pathological organizations, however, it's much worse. So in pathological organizations, one of the things you do essentially is if somebody has brought a problem forward, that person becomes a problem for you. So instead of fixing whatever the problem is with the system, you're going to fix the person who reported the problem. And you do this in two different ways. One of them is much more serious than the other. So in some organizations, what you do is you isolate that person. And in really bad organizations, you try to eliminate that person rather than simply isolating them from everybody else. You make sure that they get punished because people will pay attention to punishments. They'll watch who gets punished and why.
So let me summarize. In a generative culture, the response of leaders is look for the global fix and hold an inquiry, find out what's going on. In a bureaucratic organizational culture, much more likely to do a local fix in a reactive way, fix the presenting thing and engage in PR. Keep perhaps spinning things. And in a pathological organization, you said they're either going to isolate the person with the bad news or, in worst case, eliminate them.
Yes.
You're pointing at information flow as fundamentally different across these three cultures.
That's right. It was a long time before I realized that if you looked at the way these organizations handled information, this was a pretty good indication of their overall culture. And actually, in the end, what we found out by doing research is that it actually helps you predict what's going on in the organization. It predicts basically or reflects the leadership that you have. And it took me a while to realize that basically every time you get a new leader in a new situation, that leader is going to start changing the culture to what they're familiar with. I was in an organization one time where we had a new CEO, and everybody had been waiting for the new CEO to see what the new CEO was going to do. And when the CEO came on board, he brought a psychologist with him. And everybody thought, great, here's a psychologist who's going to listen to our problems and so forth. But it was a pathological organization. The psychologist was there as an early warning system for the boss. Who are the troublemakers going to be, and how do we get rid of them?
So, Ron, you've talked about safety and your work in the field of aviation to start with, but you've also talked about innovation and success. There's clearly a relationship between culture, safety, and performance success. How do you think about that? And how do you think culture plays into organizational safety and organizational success?
Well, I'm thinking about the aviation world. Basically, if you've got safety, that's going to contribute to your success. In the early days of aviation, many of the airplanes went down going across the English Channel or whatever, and you had to take into account the fact that the airline itself was not reliable because it couldn't be. The machinery was not good enough. So if your organization is dependent on safety, then one of the things you need to have is something that's going to make you safer. But what is it? What is that? By the same token, if you're in a situation where it depends on innovation, research and development is a good example. You need to pay attention to what are the things that are going to deliver innovation to you. How do you manage innovation? And I spent many years writing a book on the Sidewinder missile. Here's an example of innovation. here is something that basically it took a long time to work on. And there were many, many failures along the way, but in the end, they got a really fine product.
So it sounds like both in developing safety and in innovating a new product, like as you said with Sidewinder, there's a relationship between organizational culture and that eventual success in safety and in performance.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, in the case of Sidewinder, one of the things that people had on their side was that the organization had been put together by two people, engineering experts, who had essentially decided what the perfect environment for innovation would be. And they made all the compromises and the rearrangements that you needed to have people be innovative. And so one of the things that's involved in it, of course, is the ability to recognize innovators and find out how to support them. Innovators are a diverse group. Sometimes they are sort of people who work, by themselves and kind of essentially introverts. In other cases, people are, very extroverted and eager to do the things with other people. Okay, so you have to be responsive to the kind of innovator that you have. China Lake was unusual in this regard because essentially whatever it took for get the innovator to deliver their innovations is what the culture did. And I know from my the brief studies I've done in World War II, this was also one of the features. If you had somebody who needed help, you gave them the help. An example was the Norden bomb site. The guy who was the inventor of the bomb site was a person who was very critical, and he was kind of abrasive, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. So what did he do? Or what did the organization do? They found somebody that they could get to work with him who could be the interface for this person with the outside world. And so Norden was able to do the work that he did without essentially bashing people because he had this buffer. Okay. At China Lake, Bill McLean, the guy I studied, was often protected from the infelicitous aspects of his personality by people who took up the roles that Bill McLean was likely to walk away from. So when he got back from Washington, when he was head of China Lake, he would come with basically a list of agreements of the organizations that he'd gone to Washington to interface with. And one of the secretaries would basically take him aside and then get him to tell all the agreements that he'd made, and then she would go and tell the various departments, he got this for you, he got this for you, and so forth. So
it's a rich debriefing process.
Yes, but it was highly dependent on the nature of who you were debriefing. And so as soon as Bill McLean was finished with the list of all these agreements and so forth, the secretary would release him and go back to the laboratory because that's what he really liked to do anyway.
You're describing generative cultures. I mean, firstly, you're describing them as teams. They're not just individuals. They're a connection of people working together. The way you also describe them, it sort of occurs to me to say, whether it be safety or success, this isn't a straight line. This isn't a linear thing. This is a journey of exploration and innovation, and it's going to take time. And it's not necessarily sounding easy. These aren't necessarily comfortable, cozy environments. They can be quite challenging.
Yes, it's a lot of work. And one of the things that keeps you working on the job, even after hours, basically, is to realize that the work you're doing is something other people are going to depend on.
So it's the mission again.
Yes. So you've got two things. You're dependent on other people, but other people are dependent on you. You're part of a chain. You're not going to get the job done without working with the whole chain. And one of the things that people at China Lake learned to do very, very often was basically interface with the people who are going to be the users in this case of guided missiles or things like that before they finished the Sidewinder design process. somebody went out to a place where they're building aircraft carriers, because obviously the aircraft carrier had to be a good home for these guided missiles that were going to be put on the planes.
So there's a focus on the customer, there's a focus on the user during the development process.
Absolutely. And the people in the carriers were delighted, that the Sidewinder people were coming to them and saying, okay. And so in the end, basically, one of the most important aspects of this guided missile was that you could take it apart by taking the head off from the rest of the missile, because this allowed it to go in the ammunition hoists. And so if you're designing ammunition hoists for a guided missile, it's different than a shell. Okay? So there's a constant back and forth between the design process and so on. And it's useful to think of this as kind of a questioning situation. Here's the question, how do we find the answer, and so forth.
So problem solving, and you're suggesting there's a whole supply chain set up like this within the organization, including the customers. I'm starting to see why information flow quality is probably the single most important cultural predictor, because it's going to directly relate to overall success for those outcomes. And I guess within this challenge, bad news, you can't hide it. It's got to be surfaced. It's got to be dealt with.
Well, even more than that, basically, in a generative organization, the process of communicating takes into account what the other person needs to know. So it gives you basically a brief that you have to learn what it is that other person needs to know. And instead of the information being pushed on someone else, you take the information in to the other person in such a way that they know it's responding to their needs. It also has to do basically with what I call the bill of lading, which is the ability to communicate to the customer for that part or that product how this is going to meet their needs. A lot of times things are produced beautifully and then they're not really sold to the customer. In World War II, they had to have actually in the Signal Corps a special group of people who would introduce the new products to the battlefield, because a lot of times things would get made by the laboratory and then taken out to the battlefield, and the troops didn't know how to use them properly. So if things like that happen, what happens, the equipment gets pushed aside. The innovation that you've done basically is not going to be used because people don't see it. So they had this interesting invention called a New Equipment Introductory Detail, NEID. And so what they found is basically if you didn't have an NEID, then the equipment was likely to be rejected by the final users. Well, you can think about this kind of thing as something going on, the whole chain of events that brings the product to the battlefield or to the consumer and so forth, as being something that is an important answer to whatever the question is, but it's up to you to determine what the question is. What is it that the people need? How does what you've got respond to what people require?
So in a generative organizational culture, we can expect to find throughout people focusing on customer success. What is it I'm doing? Who needs this? What's it for? And ensuring that the handoffs are good, the understanding is good, and that continues right the way through to the end customer.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to leaders, because you talked about how important leaders are. How, if a leader's listening to this, how do they start to think about changing their organizational culture, even the bit that they're responsible for, their team, their area, to make it more generative?
Well, they probably put it in different terms, but essentially what happens is that they have a feeling for how things should go in organizations, how people should cooperate, how you essentially relate to the requirements of the customer in designing whatever the product is. And quite often, this is something that's neglected. So a good leader basically has a questioning mind, and they're trying to find out, what's going on, how does this relate, and so forth. And they're constantly building up information that's going to help them, first of all, decide what the problem is, and second of all, how to figure out how to communicate this solution to somebody who deeply needs this. And one of the requisites basically is the ability to detect needs, to make sure that people understand, this is a response to what you've asked for or what you need to ask for.
Put simply, I want to play this back to you. We've done this multiple times with people responsible for areas, departments in generative organisational cultures where it's been possible to do it. We've put the team together, the leadership team, in front of a whiteboard and got them to draw a circle with themselves in the middle and then describe who's upstream and who's downstream, who's feeding them and who's they're serving, and what, to your point, what are the needs of their customers, what are the problems, what's working well, what's not working well. And it feels like that conversation is the starting point then for a leader looking at the culture and thinking, not to look at culture in the sense of some of the things they might think, culture is symbols or whatever, but to actually think about the environment, who's helping them, who's supplying them, who their customers are, and what's going on, what's problematic, what's working well.
Yes, well, it's sort of like the maestro in an orchestra. You have to figure out what is needed. And so part of your responsibility is to find out where people are right now. And also, of course, to detect in the people that you're supervising what their strengths and weaknesses are. So you can build on the strengths.
You talked earlier about a generative culture involves reflection rather than simply reaction. How should they think about building in more reflection into their team working, and particularly how should they think about post-mortems if things have gone wrong?
Well, a good example is the famous story about the Citicorp building in New York, where the architectural consultant who had built the specific mechanisms in the structure to protect this from the wind, how well those things were going to work. And he was also teaching class, and one of the students said, well, how do we know this structure, which has got this novel suspension system, is actually going to work? And he said, well, we did all the calculations, so as long as everybody does everything according to the plan, it should be fine. But then he had this second thought, and the second thought was, what if it didn't go according to the plan? So he calls up the builder and says to the builder, well, he said, what did you do? And the guy said, well, we did everything you asked us to do. With a small change, we substituted rivets for welds. So the building, instead of being welded, has been riveted. So, I don't think that'll make a difference. So the consultant immediately said, well, let's find out if it's going to make a difference. So they did a completely new analysis, and they discovered that, in fact, the building had been built in such a way that it was vulnerable to high winds. Once every 16 years, a wind gust would be sufficient to essentially get the building to fall apart, thanks to the rivets that had been substituted for the welds. Okay, so now we have this giant building which has a weakness that's built into it. How do you deal with that? So what happened was, essentially, rather than announcing to the public, and they were using this, the Citicorp building was like 59 stories or something like that. So people were already using the building. What happened was they decided they would put welds into the places that they had put rivets. So every night when the secretaries went home, they would remove the panels from the walls, and they would weld things into the structure to make it stronger. After 6 months of this, basically, and of course watching the sky every second, because you could, if a big windstorm was coming, you immediately get people out of that building. The building was ready to go. And the newspapers now, who had been watching this story but being quiet about it, now were able to publish what had happened. So they managed to allow business to go on as usual, but also in a safe way. But the key thing was the second thought that needed to be checked out to make sure that things had actually happened according to plan.
So be very mindful, reflect, check, don't take assumptions for granted, go back and check. What else would you advise? You're advising a team leader who's taken over a team, and wants to create a more generative culture, what should they be reflecting on about themselves? What can they do to help the culture become more generative?
Well, a generative leader you would expect to have a very high level of self-confidence. So they wouldn't worry about their own situation, but they had to be very sensitive to the people around them. What were the capabilities of different people? What could they do, and could they actually do the job that they were expected to do? There's a story, I think one of the leaders of, was it Lockheed? Where basically the president is driving to work in his limousine one day, and he tells the driver to stop on the road. And he gets out of the car and he vomits. And the reason he vomits is because he has to fire one of his vice presidents, whom he knows to be a very good person. But this person's no longer able to carry on with the job. He can't do the job that he's been hired to do. And the leader is terribly disturbed about this because he has to fire this person. He's not going to be able to carry on with the job that he's got, which is absolutely critical for the functioning of the organization. In the same way, by learning all the capabilities of the people who are your direct reports, you learn the kinds of things they're good at or not good at. And in cases where there's a slight misfit, you try to put somebody else in the position who can act as a helper to the person in that particular capacity.
You've suggested that ego is going to be less, they're going to be less ego orientated in what you've said. To what extent do leaders to create a generative culture have to be open to being vulnerable and admitting where they're not knowledgeable or where they're making mistakes?
Well, nobody knows about everything. And so what you need is to make sure that if you have an intellectual weakness, say, it's covered by somebody else. So you have to be open to the fact of admitting, well, hey, this is really not my thing. Let's find out whose it is. I mean, a good example is Wernher von Braun, who was head of the Redstone missile facility, was not necessarily the best engineer in the group. And so he had to be able to turn to these other people who were less exuberant and extroverted and get them to do the work that he couldn't do. But he had to have enough ability to admit that, hey, this is not my thing. Let's talk to the people whose thing it is and get them to contribute here. And so even for people who are brilliant leaders, which certainly Wernher von Braun was a terrific leader, you still have, there's areas where, you're not going to be the top person. So you have to turn to whoever the top person is. Would you step in here and work on this? And by the same token, all your interactions with your direct reports are things where you're constantly gathering information about the things that they are strong on. And of course, also the hidden talents that they might have that might be valuable for you in the long run.
As a leader in trying to create a generative organization, are you encouraging coaching? Are you acting as a coach?
That's one way of thinking about it. I think the thing is that certainly in scientific groups, one of the things that they have found is associated with success in research and development is the ability to be sensitive to the people who you're working with. And not everybody, as I said, not everybody is good at everything. And so it's important for you to realize what the strengths and weaknesses of your subordinates are, what kind of things they need to be encouraged on, what kind of things they need to be supplemented on by somebody else who might have this one particular skill that you lack.
Ron, we've been using your model, drawing it on walls, literally, with leadership teams since 2015. And as a framework, it's invaluable because it helps people discuss the prevailing culture. But some clients wanted more help, and working with you, we've developed this survey instrument that gives leaders a much clearer map of the prevailing culture and can be done at a team level. What do you think the value for leaders is of having a map?
Well, the map is particularly good at communicating to other people what the choices are and what sort of concerns you have. And it's, like all graphical instruments, it allows you to see the whole thing instead of the person trying to reconstruct in their own mind what this probably looks like.
We've used, as I said, we've used your model for years. I'm surprised when we turn it into a survey and a report, I'm surprised how useful people say they found the report. The feedback's very, very positive. Why do you think it is that people aren't more... Why do I find that surprising? Why do you think people aren't instinctively using the model you created and using that as a frame of reference as they think about their culture and they think about how to change it?
Well, you're taking something which is social and emotional and turning it into a visualization. And when they get feedback on their own behavior, this is particularly valuable because now they can see, how this worked out for them. And so they're much more willing to take it seriously because it's obvious that, they're somewhere along these various lines. And if you can see where you are, it's so much better to, decide what you need to do next.
Now, mostly the work we've done so far, we've been working with generative organisational cultures. That's not surprising. It's a subsection, but they've got some bureaucratic pockets, and they've been very focused on what they need to do to strengthen their generative culture. I'm guessing it's not surprising that so far we've been working with the more generative organisational cultures.
Well, I would expect them to hire you if they're generative because they know that you're in sync with that, okay? I think I told you the anecdote about the Department of Energy getting interested in having me come in and give them a talk. And a week later, the same person calls up and he says, we can't do it. I said, why not? So he said, you've got this continuum. And then there's the pathological end of this. Well, all these people in the Department of Energy are going to look at this and they're going to say, oh, that's me. And he said, then my job is going to go away. So that gives you some idea of how powerful this feedback can be. And obviously the organization is not willing to view itself in negative terms, even though in their mind they know that it might well be.
I love your story. I suspect that's exactly what's going to happen. The organisations with the pathological culture are going to self-select out. They're not going to be using the survey. In fact, to deal with that, we created some synthetic data. We reached out to people who worked in organisations with pathological cultures and got them to come together and sort of create a report just to make sure that the instrument worked. But we're not expecting organisations like that to be so big users of the survey. What was other interesting thing to share with you is when we were using it early on, we actually prototyped it the first time with a leadership team of an organisation, 75 people, and they were asked to prepare to use the survey as part of the preparation for an offsite that they were having the following week. And their leader, their COO, put the survey out, and 48 hours later we had an 85% response rate, which we thought was slightly unusual.
Yes. How do you explain it?
I mean, is that another feature of a generative culture, that the information flow is there and the response rate was extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily high, and it later went to sort of nearly 99%.
Well, I think that's splendid. I remember when I was working with a large aviation organization that will remain nameless, and they had done a survey, and the survey showed unequivocally that there was very little faith in the organization, the top leaders. So two things happened. First of all, they didn't bother to explain away whatever it was. So they obviously didn't care. And the other thing they didn't do a second survey. And so you would have expected that even in a fairly bad organization, people would at least give some sort of BS explanation of why they'd gotten low scores. But the fact that they didn't do that at all was itself a huge message. And the message was, we don't care, you know. As opposed to, this is, you know, somebody made a mistake in computing this and so forth.
We've built the survey in two parts. So part one asks people to look at the organisational culture, look outwards, and then part two asks them to focus in on the team that they work in and look at that. So it works for team leaders. It provides useful insight for a team leader because it allows them to take stock of their team and also to have a shared view of the organisational culture around them. As well as that, what would you say would be the ideal use? Would you, if you had a CEO as a customer, would you say this is something a CEO could use to take a health check of the entire organisation?
Yes. It's always interesting to see where the pockets of pathological and generative activity are, as well as bureaucratic. Maybe bureaucratic is not a good answer. The organization is constantly faced with changes. I mean, in a world where AI is changing things very rapidly, then you need people who are highly responsive. And so if they're still doing, Plan B and it's not working out, you need to know, but it's not going to be welcomed. I had a friend who was a vice president of a Japanese corporation who realized they were making industrial scales, and he realized that they couldn't, because of the economics involved, continue to make the scales. All they could do is do the software. So he, basically told the people in the organization this was true. And so even though this saved the company, he was demoted. And the reason was he had embarrassed research and development because they should have thought about this and hadn't. And that the Japanese concentrated on the fact that he had basically insulted one part of the organization rather than that he had saved the whole organization. Very sad case, but these things happen.
We did one use of the survey where we found a quite substantial, large generative culture was existing, and it felt like it was a skunk works unit within something that was much more bureaucratic. Have you got a good example of that, where you've got an effective skunk works unit operating within a wider, more bureaucratic culture?
Well, we have a wonderful example in the U.S. Navy. There was a unit called, I think, the Innovation Unit. And this organization actually went on a ship and they took a 3D printer with them, and they made parts for the ship from the 3D printer, which they weren't authorized to do. The chief of naval operations found out about it and essentially disbanded the group, in spite of the fact that they had fixed a lot of problems. And the only way I was sensitized to this, I had a patch from the group. It's really cool. And that group was disorganized. So I've actually met not in person, but via Zoom, I've actually come across the chief of naval operations who did this. And I was tempted to say, well, hey, couldn't there have been a more innovative response to the fact that they had done these things, which even though they weren't allowed, actually were helpful for essentially combat viability.
Is you've written the book on Sidewinder, is China Lake an example of a highly effective skunk works?
Well, it came out of World War II. In World War II, there was a huge brain trust nationally. And the brain trust was made of scientists who ordinarily would go after things like, microbes or trees or whatever. And so all of a sudden, these people were put in a situation where they had to make these decisions rapidly, and they had to do things that basically were beyond the organizational chart. Well, they were very successful at doing these things, but there were a lot of people who were unhappy about this. And so when World War II was over, having won the war using a lot of these skunk works and so on techniques, the same people who had done these things were not so welcome. Because now you had a peacetime situation, a much more bureaucratic situation. And actually, China Lake at one point had asked the powers that be, basically they could continue to operate the same way they had in World War II. They got an explicit permission to continue the sort of skunk works culture that they had. And the reason they had put forward for doing this was that was the way they managed to attract the best scientific talent, which was necessary to do the things of the future. But a day came basically when that innovation and so forth was no longer looked for. Part of it was that private industry had taken up a lot of the slack, and they didn't really want the competition from the government. So what happens is that one of Jack Rabineau's laws, I think it's law number 29, is basically they put in people who are like average in terms of capability. And the problem with this is that once you have a leader who's like this, everybody under him is going to be not very good either, because that way he's not going to get threatened. So what happened in the end is that the people who had been essentially the source of innovation were taken away.
It's interesting. We work today with multiple tech companies, and you can clearly see that leadership difference still. That there are very, very good leaders, deep technical maestros, and they attract and keep talent. Even though the mission is very hard and the challenge is very great, people find a lot of meaning and value. And I'm wondering, in a sense, to what extent team leaders can safely build a shield, build a force field around their team, and keep that environment generative, even if around them there is a wider or more bureaucratic culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Cinderella. The problem is you've got people who are in violation of the corporate standard. So even though those people may be very successful, they're a problem. And in wartime, you tolerate those people because you need them. In peacetime, the need is not as great. So you can afford to have people who are somewhat slack. And it's interesting, too. I think a lot of times maestros don't really go into their prime until they face a really tough technical problem. And getting those people is absolutely what you need when you've got a difficult problem to solve. So my question would be, well, what do you do with those people in peacetime?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that Ibn Khaldun, a famous Arab theorist of society, lived in the 14th century, said basically during the peacetime you must fear the wazir. Well, wazir in Arabic means administrator. And it's interesting, so you've got this sort of Parkinson's law where basically people are not going to be helpful if there's a peacetime situation. And in war, as we learned in World War II, you have to get out of there the people who are are only good for, filling positions and so forth, and that can't really do the mission. General,
so if we use difficult mission as challenging mission as that would then hold, that same principle would hold, but the missions needs to be really difficult and challenging, and they need, as you say, they need the mandate.
They do. And often I think General Marshall, in choosing generals for World War II, went through lists of hundreds of general officers and looked for the ones that he knew could handle it. And he crossed out the others.
I want to share something else with you. When we started to use the survey based on your model and give people the feedback on the organizational culture, what was fascinating was that the organizations with the strongest generative culture the leaders got very exercised immediately on all their weaknesses, on all the things that were the least generative. They didn't spend any time talking about what was good. They focused like a laser on all the problem areas, and they talked about that. And in contrast, organizations with a less generative culture were much more inclined to sort of talk about the positives. I'm curious as to what you think might have been going on there in those two different reactions.
Oh, well, if you have a strong ego, you don't need to have it constantly stroked. And so, you don't have to worry about yourself. You can concentrate on the external situation. And so that's the thing, when you have really strong leaders, in the sense of being capable, they're going to focus on the situation, and they want to know all the problems that they might have, because it doesn't bother their ego that maybe they're imperfect, but they need to know about the imperfections because it's going to affect performance.
The number one issue that came out for them in the survey that they all were concerned about was that we'd asked team members to report on what they felt about workload balance, stress, potential burnout. And in each case, in these generative cultures, people reported that capacity was stretched right to the edge. Now, at the same time, they also reported that they were happy with their current work-life balance. And this was a tension, there was a paradox there. So we explored it with them. What do you think might have been going on for the people in the team who were reporting that they were right at the edge of their capacity, but also that they were happy with the work-life balance?
It's meaning. The people who are happy with work may be overstretched in terms of physical endurance, but they feel that they're doing something valuable. I think this issue of meaning, which appeared in the Aristotle study that Google did. People have neglected the fact that meaning was an important part of that. But meaning is something that has a great deal to do with burnout. And essentially, when meaning vanishes, what happens is people burn out. And so this could even, and this, in fact, it does happen when people are not working up to capacity. I would often ask my students, how many of you are working at full capacity at work in terms of your intellectual abilities? And the answer was usually somewhat negative. It's like, no, we're not really being challenged, okay? People, very much like racing drivers, like the idea that they can go at 10/10. And the ability to be able to perform at high speed is something that you look for in racing drivers. Well, it's also true of research and development. It's true of marketing and so forth. People like to think that they're stretched and they're actually doing what they're capable of.
You got me to read The Racing Driver by Dennis Jenkinson, and I found it fascinating, having worked with a racing team, helping them with their tech vision. The concept that you can't, as you say, racing drivers love operating sort of at 9/10, just up there, but even they would acknowledge that you can't safely operate at 10/10 and 9/10 consistently. You eventually hit some rough patch and bad things happen. You need to be able to go up there and then just come down and manage that tension. But it has a high impact on people. It takes a toll on them.
It does, but the bigger toll is taken by people who feel that the work that they've done is not appreciated, to feel they haven't solved the problems that they set out to solve. I think one of my favorite examples is the early work on high precision gunnery in the Royal Navy. And essentially, one of the ships had an exemplary performance in terms of their shooting. And the captain was distributing some monetary rewards to the gunners who had done well. And they didn't seem that happy about it. And he said, well, what's wrong? He said, well, Captain, we're happy to receive, 2 pounds or this for, our performance. But if we had beaten the ship that Percy Scott had, then we would have paid you.
fascinating insight on humans and on what motivates them. We asked people who'd had the survey report. We said to them, and we ran a survey on the survey. We said to them, if you can use this again. And one of the questions was, if you could follow up the survey, do a follow-up survey, what would be most valuable? We gave them 5 choices. 100% of the respondents chose as the option, expand the survey to a larger group now, and then repeat it in 6 months' time. What does that suggest to you? What's going on?
I think those people are chomping at the bit. They want to see what the rest of the organization is doing. They want to see where they lie in relation to the other parts of the organization. And they feel empowered by having gotten the feedback. And obviously it's nice to have, good feedback. But that's the thing, is that people who are happy in their work, to borrow something from the bridge on the River Kwai, the people who are happy in their work want to know more about it.
And
What about that sense of wanting another health check in 6 months' time?
Well, it reminds me of this married couple that I knew for most of their very successful marriage. Every New Year's Eve, they would do a survey on how they were doing in their relationship. I mean, I don't know how many married couples would be willing to do this, but the interesting thing was they liked the feedback. And so every year, of course, they came out superlatively, and they had an extraordinarily happy marriage. But it's that kind of celebratory attitude that people have when they're doing a good job, when they're proud they're doing a good job.
It takes people 15 minutes to do the survey. It takes a respondent 15 minutes to do it. And it costs a team leader. For a team of 10, it would cost $45. So about $4.50 for every person and for every additional person. How do you feel about the return on investment for that from somebody wanting to invest in the survey and get a response based, given it's based on your model?
It's cheap considering the value you get. That's my attitude about it. And
Good value for money.
Yes, and of course, but as I say, there's a celebratory quality to it. If the survey comes out good, you feel great. Now, if it doesn't come out good, that's another issue.
Well, with that in mind, we've built it so that if a CEO wants, they can plug it into their systems using an API, an application program interface, and sort of make it available throughout and routinely. Do you think any organization will be brave enough to do that?
I think you will find the generative organizations are happy to do it because they want to know. The information to them is more valuable than whatever bad vibes might come from not doing well. They need to know how they're doing.
Let's talk about why they might. We are entering an era which people are calling the era of AI. Artificial intelligence is now available in multiple different ways. More and more people are getting tools that help experienced people by augmenting their work, making them far more productive. And we're seeing obviously a lot more AI agents coming in and making the flow of information in organizations a lot faster, a lot better. That means that many people are facing, pretty unprecedented levels of turbulence and change. The ones that are thriving, the organizations that are doing well, all appear to have generative cultures.
That's right.
What do you think's going on? Why are they getting a much better response to this era of AI?
Well, it's like any other innovation. If you are an early user, you've got to lead on other people. And that's one of the things we know about early adopters, is that they tend to be optimistic about how things are going. So they will do this knowing that basically this is going to improve their performance and they'll be ahead of other people. So they feel good.
So, Ron, you said something very interesting about early adopters, which suggests that they're more likely to have a generative culture. Is that true?
Yes, it is. That's one of the reasons they're early adopters, because they tend to be more optimistic about change. And instead of trying to protect their flanks, they tend to think about, the distant target that they're getting closer to.
So in terms of the era of AI, the leaders in those organizations are more likely to encourage experimentation and to get people to start to embrace the tools and embrace the novelty and try things out.
Yes. Well, the other thing is that basically if somebody makes a mistake, that's not going to deter people who are in an innovative organization. You expect to make mistakes, but you expect to bounce back from them.
Most people adopting AI have figured out they need to run multiple experiments to work out what works well. Again, does that mean that those organizations with a generative culture have got an advantage?
Yes. Yes, and in fact, in generative cultures, certainly guided missile development is a good example. You often will do 2 or 3 different versions of what you're doing to find out which one is going to work well. And it may not be the one that you initially thought would have been the winner.
Are there any examples where people have got teams competitively racing against each other to develop the first working proof of something?
Oh yeah, the Sidewinder missile is an excellent example. I forget how many people were working on different versions of the Seeker, but they tried at least 5 that I can think of, and the whole issue was, what can we make that's going to work and will be reliable? And the different Seekers came out with different scores at the end. But if you're confident that in the end you'll pick the one that you're going to do, I think this is also true. This was also true in World War II, when Nimitz actually told people they had to have a combat information center, but he didn't specify how this had to work. So everybody tried different versions of this, and then they rapidly found out which ones were the best way of having a combat information center.
And they shared the information. The information was flowing around.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That sounds like a very similar pattern that's going to happen here. What about individuals? How should leaders encourage people in terms of getting them to adopt AI?
Well, I think they should say that, our future is associated with this, and we know that you can do this, and if you make a screw up, well, this is simply part of the learning process, and we expect you to screw up from time to time. And of course you will, but that's okay. It's part of the process, just like, falling off a bicycle when you're trying to learn how to ride it, but you eventually, in the end, you become proficient.
And the climate in which people are working is going to be safe. There's we talk about the available envelope of stress, as in it's very big, because people aren't worried as they are in a pathological culture that somebody's going to sort of be attacking them with a power play or using information against them. People aren't worried as they are in a bureaucratic culture that they're not following the operating model. People are being told, no, experiment, figure it out. As you say, try something out, try and make this work. It's critical. They're therefore more likely, are they not, to use AI in a way that actually fundamentally changes how things work.
Absolutely. Yes. So, what happens is basically the innovation process, there are no guarantees. So you do the best you can, and eventually out of these tentative solutions, the right solutions will appear and will be instituted. And then there will be another set of things to work on.
Can people in a generative culture, are people likely to feel braver, that they can actually take more safe risks?
Absolutely, because if failure is expected from time to time, they're not going to worry about failures, and there will be failures. So What happens in the end then is that you're confident because you've tested the systems that work, and you've also tested systems that didn't work. And so you chose the ones obviously that did work, and that's what you did more of.
You've talked earlier about a bill of lading, the old maritime term in terms of sharing information. I wanted to sort of dig in a little bit about the technology itself with you. The AI, the adoption of AI is doing something really interesting inside organizations. It's taking a lot of unstructured data that may be trapped in a silo in a department in a particular place, and it's making it available elsewhere because people are using technology to literally allow search to work, allow semantic search to work, or they're building vector databases and they're discovering it. People are finding they can reach out and chat to data, discover what's there, find the right thing, and it's working a lot better. So information flow, particularly information flow across silos, is rapidly increasing in organizations that are adopting this, the most generative ones, and they're getting, if you like, an additional bonus from doing that. They're not only changing the way they operate, the information flow in itself is getting faster. That seems to be encouraging some organizations with bureaucratic cultures to sort of adopt faster and sort of pay attention. So it feels as if AI technology has the power to actually shape and change, or positively contribute to shaping and changing organizational cultures and make many of them more generative. Given that, how should senior leaders be thinking about aligning cultural change with the adoption of AI?
Well, to go back a step for a moment, basically, the bill of lading can be something that AI helps to build. It tells you what you've got. People need that. They need to know. So you're much more likely to get people realizing that they actually have a tool that will help them work on the problem that they've got. One of the biggest problems in organizations is, in the past, people have built up a corporate memory. And that corporate memory has been in many cases meticulously put together, but then it's not used. And the reason it's not used is it's not available to people. And so when you get an innovation crunch, which of course happens a lot in big business, then you can actually turn to AI to help you search the records that you have, because they are available to scrutiny thanks to AI. I don't know how many cases people have told me, said, well, we had all this, corporate memory, but we didn't have time to search it and find the stuff that we needed. We needed to get on with whatever the transformation was. Well, AI is likely to provide a tool that will help you search what you've done previously and look for the things that are valuable to you right now.
And that should lead to change. For those organizations that don't adopt it, what is it that's going to make change harder? Let's take the organizations with a bureaucratic culture. Why do they find change so difficult, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. So I look at one of the distinctions made by anthropologists about smart knowledge versus standard knowledge. So the thing is that often the problem with bureaucracies is that to actually get the job done, you have to use the smart knowledge, which means that you're doing things that the organization doesn't necessarily approve of. They like the results, but they don't like the process that you're engaging in. So what I think is that essentially with AI, you can use the smart knowledge essentially to help you solve the problems, but bureaucracies don't want that. And time after time, what we find is that when somebody does something in an informal way, let's say, using the smart knowledge, the bureaucracy is offended because you haven't done things according to the rule book. When I was at China Lake, one of the things that they pointed out was a row of books. And I said, well, what are those books? And they said, oh, those are all the decisions that they made about stuff that we had done to make sure that we wouldn't do it again. And the weight of precedent is a serious bar to future innovation, because if you can't do it the way that works best, what do you say? How do you disguise the fact that you've done something using smart knowledge, but you can't talk about it?
The other thing we've seen is organizations that are very siloed seem to be strongly resistant to adopting AI because of the threat of change to the silos, to the structure, because work is going to be redistributed.
Yes, well, nobody likes to, sort of wash their dirty underwear in public. And for many people, what's going on inside their silo, may not be terribly effective, but, at least, nobody's going to see our mistakes. Well, in a world where people can see your mistakes, you're going to be less likely to try something risky because, that your mistakes are going to be visible. A lot of bureaucracies depend on the fact that their processes are inscrutable, and it takes you, years to get accustomed to how to do things the company way, maybe the government way, and you don't want to give that up. So that's another interesting thing, is that knowing the organization's secret rituals, and all organizations have secret rituals. You're not going to want to share because everybody has to sort of go through the process of boot camp and advanced training and so forth. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of the decisions we make are not made necessarily on the best information. They're not necessarily based on the best thing that the person who's the practitioner knows, but rather what is going to be socially acceptable. And if what you've done isn't socially acceptable, then you have to spend additional energy covering up that you did something the smart knowledge way instead of the standard way.
We don't get much access to organizations with pathological cultures, but the insight that we've got from talking to people who work in them, they are really stuck and way behind with the adoption of AI. And it seems to be two things. One is a lack of trust. There's just a pervasive lack of trust within the organization. And the other is that they're trying to control the innovation top down, and it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, I think, the thing is with management studies, you can read about pathological organizations if you read the newspapers or whatever is your equivalent, because these are things that tend to make headlines because people did something that they shouldn't have done. So the interesting thing is that in writing a book on information flow, it's easy to find case studies of pathological behavior because they end up often blowing up and being covered by the news media. The problem is when you've got something that's working and it's not spectacular, it's hard to cover that. So it's hard to find bureaucratic stories that are interesting to read, except the ones where there's a failure.
Are there any other characteristics of generative organizational cultures that leaders should be considering, thinking about, as they seek to adopt and get value from AI? I'm thinking particularly of requisite imagination. How much does that apply here?
Well, requisite imagination is basically the ability to imagine what the consequences of, and often the far-flung consequences of what your actions are going to be. And if you're not into sort of futuring, then you're not going to be involved and engaged and looking forward, enthusiastic about basically AI, because it's going to change things. And for many people, the organization is desirable because it represents a predictable environment. When you put some unpredictable parts of it, a lot of people are going to find that very uncomfortable. And change can be uncomfortable. It doesn't have to be. I think the thing is that basically it'd be nice if you could think about what you're doing as a kind of sport, where you're adventuring here and there and so forth. But people often tend, especially if you've been in the pathological culture, you think about, I don't want to make a mistake. But this desire not to make a mistake, so that whatever you're going to do is perfect, is a good way to essentially stop innovation. Because nobody wants to be in a situation where something is not going to work out. Much like the Navy team that did the 3D printer stuff and then got in trouble for it, not because they'd actually endangered the operation, but rather because they'd broken the rules.
They've broken the rules. So we should think about the era of AI as actually also the era of the generative culture. And those organizations that have a generative culture are likely to thrive. And those who've got a bureaucratic culture are likely to find their cultures becoming more generative if they're successful in adopting AI. And I'm guessing that ones with the pathological culture are going to fall behind because they're going to be stuck and frozen.
Yes. Well, I think there'll be a variety of responses to failure. Part of the problem with the business community is that we have a model where basically people at the top will experiment with cutting costs. This is a good example. With cutting costs, and then essentially just at the moment when all these things are likely to bite the organization, they step off and they join another organization. And that's a big problem in business. You want people who not only have a presence but also have a loyalty to the organization where they're going to sit. They'll sit through things even when things are bad. Well, so if you are the kind of guy who basically is going to be a love 'em and lose 'em, that's not going to work because that organization is going to go down the tube. One of the things about organizations that are really good and long-term stable is you've got people who are in there for the full Monty. They're not, being a runaway lover. They're gonna sit through this and they're gonna make it work. Boeing, classically in the past, has had that kind of leadership, where people expect to be in the seat, the next week, the next month, the next year. And so people were responsible because they knew, whatever they did was going to stay with them. So, and the great mistake, of course, Boeing made was to try to adopt this, love 'em and lose 'em culture, because it doesn't work with airplanes. I mean, airplanes are big, they're complicated. It takes an enormous amount of energy. It takes a lot of corporate memory. And I'm delighted to see that Boeing has now changed the culture in the way that they now are far more responsible about the decisions they make, because they realize that everybody's going to be in the seat next year, as long as basically people keep working at it. I think one of my models of corporate success is the 747. And people don't realize with the 747 that for many years, the people who were involved in this process looked at something where they lost $1 million a day while they couldn't get this airplane to work. So Sutter, the guy who was in charge of this, had an amazing ability to get loyalty from his people. And he went to Boeing and said, well, I know we're losing $1 million a day, but, we're going to have this wonderful airplane in the end. And they did. Think about the kind of endurance that something like this requires. These people worked 60-hour weeks. I mean, who knows how much they saw their families. They were in a situation where they were losing money, but they had this goal in mind, and they believed that Sutter would get them there, okay? This requires a totally different kind of personality from what's often emphasized in business, which is, make some quick bucks and then you can flee.
Ron, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure.
Absolutely.